3 years ago, we didn't need anybody. We're going to shortly be energy dominant. We're going to make so much money. We're going to pay off debt. The $35 trillion in debt, we're going to pay it off. We're going to get it done fast, too.
When you hear the number $36 trillion, it's easy to feel like a statistic that's just too big to grasp. But the reality is that's the current size of the US national debt, and it's been growing for decades. To put it in perspective, if you stacked $1 bills on top of each other, $36 trillion would reach all the way to the moon and back, several times. It's a lot of money, and believe me, it's something that affects all of us in one way or another. I'll talk about this in just a minute. What's worse is that the debt interest payments have now grown too, recently crossing the $1.1 trillion mark. This figure is more than the GDP of Sweden and Belgium combined. Imagine that. Whether you're paying taxes, receiving government benefits, or simply living in a world where inflation impacts prices, the national debt is a part of your daily life. What many US citizens also don't understand is that the debt and its interest payments grow. That means your precious tax dollars aren't going to your community or country, but to debt holders like China, who America owes money to. Yes, that means that your taxpayer dollars are funding the CCP's plans. And that's exactly why the growing US debt has been such a point of focus in recent years. Now that President Donald Trump is in office, he's made it his top priority to eliminate national debt. One of his election promises was to reduce the national debt, and now that he has the power to, President Trump's proposed a plan to stop this debt from rising any further. First off, let's talk about how the United States got into this multi-trillion-dollar mess. The US debt didn't just appear overnight. It's been building up over many years, through different administrations and economic cycles. Think of it like a snowball rolling down a hill, getting bigger and bigger as it goes. The US government has been borrowing money to cover its expenses for a long time, and this borrowing's added up to a pretty hefty sum. To make this issue clearer, I'll split it into a why and how problem. Why does the US have debt, and how does the mechanics of a country having debt even work? You must admit, it's weird saying the world's most powerful nation owes money. One of the primary ways this happens is through the issuance of bonds. When the government needs to borrow money, it sells bonds to investors. These bonds are essentially IOUs, where the government promises to pay back the borrowed amount with interest at a later date. Investors, including individuals, corporations, and foreign governments, buy these bonds as a relatively safe investment. There are different types of government bonds, including treasury bills, notes, and bonds. Treasury bills are short-term bonds that mature in a year or less, while treasury notes have maturities ranging from 2 to 10 years. Treasury bonds are long-term bonds with maturities of 20 to 30 years. The government pays interest on these bonds, which adds to the overall cost of borrowing. The interest rates on government bonds can vary based on factors like the overall economic environment and the government's credit rating. When interest rates are low, borrowing's cheaper for the government. However, when interest rates rise, the cost of borrowing increases, adding to the debt burden. In addition to bonds, the government can also borrow money from other sources, such as foreign governments and international organizations. For example, countries like China and Japan hold significant amounts of US debt. This means that the US owes money to these countries, and they have a vested interest in the stability of the US economy. As I touched on at the beginning of the video, China holds a significant portion of US debt, and this has been an important part of the financial relationship between the two countries for many years. Essentially, China's bought a lot of US government bonds, also known as treasury securities, as a way to invest the large amounts of US dollars it earns from its trade surplus with the US. Here's how it all came about. China exports more to the US than it imports, so it ends up with a lot of US dollars. Now, a normal person would sell the dollars to buy their local currency, but China doesn't want to do that because if you buy yuan, it increases yuan value relatively to the dollar, which in turn makes Chinese exports more expensive. So instead of just holding on to all that cash, China buys the US Treasury bonds because they're considered a safe investment. Treasury bonds are backed by the US government, so they're very low risk. Currently, China holds close to $1 trillion of US debt, which is a big chunk of the US national debt. While this number fluctuates, it's consistently made China the second largest foreign holder of US debt, right after Japan. To put it into perspective, foreign countries hold about $7.5 trillion of US debt, and China's share is around 13 to 15% of that total. So why does this matter? For one, it creates an economic interdependence between China and the US investments. However, there's also a lot of political and economic power wrapped up in this relationship. Because China holds so much US debt, some people worry that China could use this as leverage. For example, if China decided to suddenly sell off its US Treasury bonds as it did in November last year, it could cause US interest rates to rise and make it more expensive for the US to borrow money. This would hurt the US economy. But China's been careful not to overdo that because it would hurt their own financial interests too. Selling off extremely large amounts of US debt would likely cause the value of the remaining bonds to drop, making China's remaining investments lose value. But the situation isn't just about economics. There's also a geopolitical side to things. As tensions rise between the US and China, especially over trade, military issues, and things like the South China Sea, it raises the question of whether China might use its holdings of US debt as a political tool. While there's no evidence that China's used this debt as a bargaining chip, it's something to keep an eye on as the two countries continue to navigate their relationship. As we talk about China and the US, I know it's tempting to think of all this as a national issue that'll play out geopolitically. We also can't talk about Trump's plans for dealing with US debt without touching on the debt ceiling issue. Just looking at this post from Trump shows how annoying of an issue it is for him. So, what is all this about? The debt ceiling is essentially a cap set by Congress on how much the federal government's allowed to borrow. This limit is meant to control the national debt and ensure that the government doesn't spend beyond its means. However, the government often runs a budget deficit, meaning it spends more than it collects in revenue. To cover this deficit, the government borrows money, which adds to the national debt. When the government reaches the debt ceiling, it can't borrow any more money unless Congress raises or suspends the limit. If the debt ceiling isn't raised, the government risks defaulting on its obligations, which could have severe economic consequences. For example, it might not be able to pay Social Security benefits, military salaries, or interest on the national debt. In recent years, the debt ceiling's become a contentious political issue. Lawmakers often use it as a bargaining chip to negotiate spending cuts or other policy changes. This has led to several high-stakes standoffs and last-minute deals to avoid default. For instance, in 2023, the debt ceiling was suspended through the Fiscal Responsibility Act, temporarily staving off an economic crisis. As of January 2025, the debt ceiling was reinstated at $36.1 trillion, and the Treasury Department has been using extraordinary measures to keep the government from defaulting. These measures include pausing payments to certain government accounts to meet more pressing obligations. However, these are only short-term solutions, and Congress will need to act to raise or suspend the debt ceiling to avoid a default. Because of all this, Trump has suggested that the debt ceiling should be abolished altogether. He argues that the debt ceiling is unnecessary because it's consistently raised and merely serves a psychological purpose. This is proven in that the US has raised the debt ceiling 103 times since 1939. Trump's nominee for Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has expressed support for working with Congress to repeal the debt ceiling. By eliminating the ceiling, Trump believes that the government can avoid the recurring crises and focus term fiscal planning. In the big picture, if the government can successfully stimulate economic growth and cut spending, it may reduce the frequency of hitting the debt ceiling. This is because the overall borrowing is lower, reducing the pressure to raise or suspend the debt limit. That would also eliminate a lot of headaches for Trump.